Dr. Marcus Reed's hands froze on the muddy fur, his breath catching as the bear cub's dark eyes locked onto his with an intelligence that shouldn't exist. The creature he'd just pulled from Miller's Creek wasn't struggling to escape. It was studying him. This wasn't normal wild animal behavior. Sarah Mitchell's coffee mug shattered against the sanctuary floor as she watched through the window, her maternal instincts screaming that something profound was happening. Frank Henderson stumbled backward, his weathered veterinarian hands trembling as decades of experience told him this moment defied everything he knew about wildlife. The cub that should have been terrified instead pressed closer to Marcus, as if recognizing a kindred soul drowning in his own desperate circumstances. Marcus felt his chest tighten, remembering another pair of trusting eyes, his son Tommy's, looking at him with the same wordless plea for salvation. "Get the tranquilizer," Frank whispered, though his voice carried an edge of wonder rather than fear. What had Marcus rescued from those dark waters, and why did saving this creature feel like his last chance to save himself? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that life-changing morning at Miller's Creek, Dr. Marcus Reed had been a different man. His research station sat like a lonely sentinel among the towering pines of Montana's wilderness, where he studied wildlife patterns with the methodical precision of someone trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the quiet desperation of a father watching his world crumble one medical bill at a time. The framed photograph on his desk showed a gap-toothed 8-year-old boy with Marcus's same serious eyes. Tommy Reed hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. Lost somewhere in the labyrinth of severe autism that no amount of love or money seemed able to penetrate. The experimental treatment at Denver Children's Hospital offered hope, $500,000 worth of hope that Marcus's researcher's salary couldn't touch. "I save animals because I can't save what matters most," he'd whispered to that photograph every morning, the weight of failure pressing down like the Montana sky before a storm. 20 miles away, Sarah Mitchell swept the empty corridors of her wildlife sanctuary, each footstep echoing in spaces that once rang with laughter. At 52, she'd buried a husband, watched her children scatter to distant cities, and found herself talking to injured raccoons like they were old friends. The sanctuary had become her lifeline after cancer took Robert, but even rescued animals eventually healed and left her behind. Empty nest syndrome hits different when the nest was built for love, she'd tell visitors, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her maternal instincts had nowhere to go except toward creatures that couldn't stay. In the shadow of Glacier Peak, Frank Henderson moved through his retirement like a ghost haunting his own life. At 78, the former veterinarian's hands still steady enough to suture wounds, he carried secrets that made sleep elusive. His wife Emma's chair remained exactly where she'd left it 5 years ago, and his son's military medals gathered dust on a shelf he couldn't bear to clean. "A man's worth ain't measured by what he takes, but what he gives back," Frank would mutter while treating injured wildlife in his makeshift clinic. But some givings felt more like takings, and the guilt ate at him like a cancer he couldn't operate away. The fourth player in this unfolding drama prowled the same mountains with different intentions. Jake Morrison, 45 and bitter as winter wind, had once worn a Ranger's badge with pride. The 2008 budget cuts had stripped away more than his job. They'd taken his family, his dignity, and his faith in a system that valued trees over the people who protected them. They chose trees over people. "Now I choose money over everything," Jake told his reflection in the rearview mirror of his pickup truck, Asian black market contacts saved in his phone under false names. None of them knew that fate was preparing to weave their separate sorrows into a single story of redemption, centered around a bear cub whose survival would test everything they believed about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. The morning mist clung to Miller's Creek like a shroud when Marcus Reed arrived to conduct his routine water quality tests. April in Montana meant unpredictable weather, and today carried the crisp promise of either sunshine or storm. He'd been tracking pollution levels from the old mining operations upstream, work that felt increasingly meaningless when measured against Tommy's deteriorating condition. The previous night's phone call from Denver Children's Hospital echoed in his mind. "Mr. Reed, we need to discuss Tommy's treatment timeline." Marcus knelt beside the creek's edge, his testing equipment spread across the rocky bank like surgical instruments. The water ran clear and cold, carrying the mineral scent of snowmelt from the high peaks. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine bringing Tommy here someday, teaching him to skip stones the way his own father had taught him. But Tommy's world had no room for such simple pleasures. A sound broke through his reverie, a low, desperate whimper that seemed to rise from the creek itself. Marcus froze, his trained ear distinguishing between the normal forest sounds and something distinctly wrong. The whimpering came again, weaker this time, from somewhere upstream around the bend where the creek narrowed between moss-covered boulders. He abandoned his equipment and followed the sound, his boots slipping on the wet stones. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. A massive black bear lay crumpled on the bank, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Steel trap marks scarred her left hind leg, the wounds festering and fly-blown. But it wasn't the mother's condition that sent ice through Marcus's veins. It was the small, dark shape, struggling weakly in the swift current just beyond her reach. A bear cub, no more than 6 months old, had fallen into the creek and lacked the strength to fight the current. Its tiny paws churned frantically at the water, but hypothermia was winning the battle. The mother bear had clearly tried to reach her cub before succumbing to her injuries, her massive head stretched toward the water in a final futile gesture of maternal love. Marcus didn't hesitate. He plunged into the creek, the shock of 40-degree water stealing his breath. The current was stronger than it looked, pulling at his legs as he fought toward the drowning cub. His fingers brushed wet fur once, twice, before finally closing around the small body. The cub weighed perhaps 30 pounds, but in the water, fighting the current and his own numbing limbs, it felt like lifting a boulder. He dragged them both to shore, his lungs burning from the cold and exertion. The cub lay motionless in his arms, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. Water streamed from its nostrils, and its body felt cold as river stone. Marcus had seen enough wildlife rescues to know the signs of severe hypothermia. Without immediate intervention, the cub would die within minutes. But as he looked down at the small, helpless creature, something extraordinary happened. The cub's eyes fluttered open, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly into Marcus's soul. Most wild animals in distress showed only terror when handled by humans. This cub showed something else entirely, a desperate, almost human gratitude. The moment stretched between them, man and wild creature connected by the simple act of one life saving another. The cub didn't struggle or try to escape. Instead, it pressed closer to Marcus's warmth, tiny paws grasping at his jacket, as if understanding that this human meant safety. "Okay, little one," Marcus whispered, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. "I've got you." He wrapped the cub in his spare jacket and ran to his truck, one hand supporting the small head that lolled weakly against his chest. The drive to Sarah's sanctuary took 20 minutes that felt like hours, the cub's breathing growing more labored with each mile. Marcus found himself talking to the animal, promising things he had no right to promise. You're going to be okay. Sarah will know what to do. We'll take care of you." Sarah Mitchell was feeding her morning patients when Marcus burst through the sanctuary doors, soaking wet and cradling what looked like a bundle of dark fur. Her maternal instincts, dormant for so long, flared to life at the sight of the helpless creature. "Dear God, what happened?" she breathed, immediately reaching for towels and heating lamps. "Found him drowning. Mother's dead upstream, trap wounds." Marcus's words came in short bursts as they worked together to warm the cub. "He's hypothermic, probably been in the water for a while." Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for injuries while Marcus set up the warming station. But even as they worked, both of them noticed something unusual about their patient. The cub watched their every movement with an alertness that seemed almost supernatural for an animal in shock. When Sarah spoke softly to him, his ears perked forward as if he understood not just her tone but her words. "Frank needs to see this," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "There's something different about this one." Frank Henderson arrived within the hour, his weathered hands carrying the same gentleness they'd possessed through 40 years of veterinary practice. But when he examined the cub, his expression grew troubled. The small body bore faint scars that suggested previous medical intervention, neat, surgical lines hidden beneath the thick fur. "Where exactly did you find the mother?" Frank asked, his voice carefully neutral. Marcus described the location, watching Frank's face grow more grave with each detail. The old veterinarian ran his hands over the cub's skull, feeling for abnormalities, his touch both professional and strangely protective. "We need to keep this quiet," Frank said finally, "at least until we know more about what we're dealing with." The cub, whom Sarah had already begun calling Bruno, seemed to understand that his life had taken a dramatic turn. He accepted their care with a trust that broke their hearts and filled them with purpose. As the day wore on, it became clear that saving Bruno had somehow saved something in each of them as well. 2 weeks after the rescue, Bruno had transformed from a dying cub into something that defied Marcus's understanding of wild animal behavior. The young bear had not only survived his ordeal, but seemed to thrive under their care in ways that challenged everything Marcus knew about wildlife rehabilitation. Bruno displayed an uncanny ability to solve problems that should have been beyond his developmental stage, opening simple latches, manipulating objects with deliberate intent, and most unnervingly, responding to human emotions with an empathy that felt almost supernatural. Marcus found himself spending hours at the sanctuary, ostensibly to monitor Bruno's recovery, but truthfully because the cub's presence filled a void he hadn't realized was consuming him. When Bruno looked at him with those impossibly intelligent dark eyes, Marcus saw something that reminded him painfully of Tommy. A unique mind trapped in circumstances beyond its control, desperately trying to communicate across an impossible divide. "He's not like the others," Sarah observed one morning as they watched Bruno carefully stack wooden blocks into a perfect pyramid, a task that had taken him only 3 attempts to master. "I've rehabilitated dozens of bear cubs, Marcus. They're smart animals, but this—" She gestured helplessly at Bruno's latest creation. "This is different." The truth Marcus had been avoiding crashed down on him like a rock slide. He needed to tell them about Tommy, about the crushing weight of medical bills that made sleep impossible and turned every day into a countdown toward inevitable loss. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped by the fear that speaking his failure aloud would make it somehow more real. That evening, as Frank examined Bruno's continued progress, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID made his blood turn to ice. Denver Children's Hospital. He stepped outside to take the call, leaving Sarah and Frank to marvel at Bruno's latest accomplishment. He had somehow figured out how to operate the simple radio in Sarah's office, tuning it to a classical music station with methodical precision. "Mr. Reed?" Dr. Jennifer Chen's voice carried the careful neutrality that medical professionals used to deliver devastating news. I'm calling about Tommy's treatment window. The experimental procedure we discussed has been approved for one more patient, but we need a commitment within 30 days. The cost remains $500,000, and I'm afraid insurance— I understand, Marcus interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. 30 days. When he returned inside, Sarah and Frank were watching Bruno with expressions of wonder and growing concern. The cub had somehow managed to unlock his enclosure and was now sitting calmly beside Sarah's desk, as if waiting for permission to explore further. Marcus, Frank's voice carried decades of veterinary experience and not a small amount of worry. We need to talk about what Bruno is. The words tumbled out of Marcus like water bursting through a dam. He told them about Tommy, about the autism that had stolen his son's voice, about the experimental surgery that offered hope at a price he couldn't afford. He explained how watching Bruno's extraordinary intelligence both inspired and tortured him, seeing proof that unique minds could flourish under the right circumstances, while his own son remained locked away in a world Marcus couldn't reach. $500,000, Marcus finished, his voice breaking. I have 30 days to find $500,000, or Tommy gets transferred to long-term residential care. They're giving up on him, and I don't know how to save him. Sarah's maternal heart shattered at the parallel between Marcus's situation and her own losses. She reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand on Bruno's head as the cub moved to sit beside Marcus's chair. Sometimes God sends us what we need, not what we want, she said softly, watching Bruno's remarkably human-like response to Marcus's distress. Frank remained silent, but his weathered face betrayed an internal struggle that went deeper than sympathy. His veterinary expertise told him that Bruno's development was abnormal in ways that suggested intervention. Surgical scars hidden beneath thick fur, brain activity that defied natural explanation, behaviors learned too quickly and with too much sophistication, but speaking those suspicions aloud would open doors that might be better left closed. Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Jake Morrison appeared at the sanctuary's front gate, his ranger uniform replaced by civilian clothes that somehow made him more menacing rather than less. He claimed to be investigating reports of livestock attacks in the area, but his questions focused exclusively on unusual bear activity and whether anyone had reported finding orphaned cubs. Bruno's reaction to Jake was immediate and visceral. The cub, who had shown nothing but trust and affection toward his human caretakers, backed away with his fur standing on end, emitting a low growl that seemed to come from some primal place of recognition and fear. The intensity of Bruno's reaction sent chills through all three humans, suggesting a history none of them understood. "That's quite a bear you've got there," Jake observed, his eyes calculating as he watched Bruno's defensive posture. "Almost seems like he knows me." Funny thing about bears, they never forget a face, especially one that's caused them trouble. After Jake left, the sanctuary felt different, charged with an undercurrent of threat that none of them could quite articulate. Frank's hands shook as he double-checked the locks on Bruno's enclosure, muttering under his breath about complications and unfinished business. That night, Marcus sat in his truck outside the sanctuary, watching Bruno through the window as the cub paced restlessly in his enclosure. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, Jennifer. "Tommy asked about you today. First time he's initiated communication in months. Don't let him down again." The weight of impossible choices pressed down on Marcus like the Montana sky before a storm. Bruno represented hope and wonder, a connection to something pure in a world that had shown him little but disappointment and loss. But Tommy was his son, his flesh and blood, his responsibility above all others. As if sensing his torment, Bruno approached the window and placed one massive paw against the glass. In that moment, Marcus saw not just an extraordinary animal but a kindred spirit, another unique mind struggling to find its place in a world that didn't understand its gifts. The parallel to Tommy was so strong it took his breath away. "What am I supposed to do?" Marcus whispered to the darkness, knowing that the next few weeks would force him to choose between saving a bear who had already captured his heart and saving the son who needed him most. Frank's words from earlier echoed in his mind. Some rules are made to be broken, especially when love's involved. But Marcus was beginning to realize that sometimes love meant making choices that felt like betrayal, and that the greatest rescue might require the greatest sacrifice. The countdown had begun, and Marcus Reed was running out of time to save everyone he loved. The following weeks transformed the sanctuary into something that felt more like a home than Marcus had known in years. Bruno, now 8 months old and weighing nearly 100 pounds, had developed routines that intertwined seamlessly with the daily lives of his 3 human caretakers. Each morning, he would greet Marcus with a gentle head bump that felt disturbingly like a hug, and each evening he would sit quietly beside Sarah while she read aloud from whatever book caught her fancy, his dark eyes following the movement of her lips as if he understood every word. Marcus found himself teaching Bruno simple commands, initially as a form of enrichment, but increasingly because the cub's learning capacity seemed limitless. Bruno mastered sit, stay, and come within days. More remarkably, he began to anticipate needs, bringing Sarah her dropped reading glasses, alerting Frank when other animals in the sanctuary showed signs of distress, and somehow sensing when Marcus was about to receive one of those devastating phone calls from Denver. "He's reading us," Sarah observed one afternoon as they watched Bruno carefully arrange his toys in a pattern that seemed to mirror the way she organized her medicine cabinet. "Not just our moods, our intentions, our needs. I've never seen anything like it." The bond between Bruno and Marcus deepened daily, creating a connection that both healed and tortured the grieving father. When Marcus received updates about Tommy's condition, small improvements one day, setbacks the next, Bruno seemed to absorb his emotional state like a sponge, offering comfort in the form of a massive paw placed gently on Marcus's shoulder, or simply sitting close enough that Marcus could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. But the idyllic routine was increasingly disrupted by harsh realities. Marcus's phone rang constantly with calls from Denver Children's Hospital, insurance companies, and Tommy's residential facility. His ex-wife Jennifer's messages grew more desperate. "Tommy's having more good days. Dr. Chen thinks the window for surgery might be narrowing. Please, Marcus, find a way." The financial pressure was crushing. Marcus had liquidated his retirement account, borrowed against his research station, and even considered selling his father's vintage truck. Actions that netted him barely $50,000 against the $500,000 needed. Private collectors had begun reaching out, somehow having learned about Bruno's extraordinary abilities. The offers were substantial. $200,000 for a trained bear from a Texas exotic animal ranch, even more from private collectors who promised excellent care without providing details about their intentions. Each offer felt like a betrayal, but Marcus found himself saving the contact information nonetheless. Late at night, he would sit in his truck outside the sanctuary, watching Bruno sleep peacefully in his custom enclosure, and calculate how much more time Tommy had before the surgical window closed forever. Sarah noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor, but misinterpreted its cause. She began dropping hints about Bruno's permanent placement, assuming Marcus was growing attached and needed reassurance about the cub's future. "He could stay here forever, you know," she said one evening as they watched Bruno demonstrate his latest accomplishment, opening a complex puzzle box in under 2 minutes. "The sanctuary could be his home. We could be his family." The word family hit Marcus like a physical blow. Bruno wasn't his family. Tommy was. But watching the cub interact with Sarah's maternal affection and Frank's gentle guidance, Marcus realized that Bruno had indeed found his family, and the thought of disrupting that for money made him physically sick. Frank's behavior grew increasingly peculiar as the weeks passed. The elderly veterinarian spent hours studying Bruno with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. He took detailed notes, made cryptic phone calls, and seemed to be wrestling with some internal conflict that aged him visibly. When Sarah asked about his concerns, Frank would only mutter about complications and things that should have stayed buried. The truth emerged during one of Frank's late-night examinations when he thought the others had gone home. Marcus returned to the sanctuary to retrieve forgotten paperwork and found Frank in Bruno's enclosure, running his hands over the cub's skull with the precision of someone looking for specific landmarks. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded, startling Frank so badly that he nearly fell. Frank's face went pale in the moonlight streaming through the windows. For a long moment he said nothing, his weathered hands still resting on Bruno's head as the cub dozed peacefully between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of unbearable guilt. "His mother," Frank began, then stopped, gathering courage for words that had been choking him for weeks. "The bear you found dead by the creek. I killed her." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" "She was dying," Frank continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Infection from the trap wounds had gone septic. She was in agony, Marcus. I'd been tracking her for days, trying to get close enough to help, but every time I approached, she'd drag herself further into the wilderness. She was protecting him." Frank's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Bruno. She knew she was dying, but she kept trying to find somewhere safe for her cub. The confession spilled out in broken fragments. Frank had finally cornered the mother bear near Miller's Creek, using tranquilizers to sedate her enough for examination. But the infection was too advanced, the damage too severe. She was dying slowly, in excruciating pain, and there was nothing his medical expertise could do to save her. "So I made the choice I've made too many times before," Frank whispered. "I ended her suffering. One injection, and she went peacefully. I thought the cub was already dead. The water was so cold, and he'd been in there so long, I was going to bury them together." Marcus stared at the old man, trying to process the magnitude of what Frank had done and hidden. "You've been carrying this guilt while watching Bruno thrive." "Every day," Frank nodded. "Watching him learn and grow, seeing how much joy he brings to Sarah, how much he means to you. I took away his mother, and I can't give her back. But I can protect his future, even if it means confessing to mercy killings that could destroy my reputation and land me in federal prison." The weight of Frank's secret added another layer of complexity to Marcus's already impossible situation. Bruno had lost his mother to human intervention, however well-intentioned. Now Marcus was considering essentially selling him to save his own son. The moral parallels were uncomfortable and unavoidable. Their conversation was interrupted by a sound from the sanctuary's front office, footsteps and the creak of a door that should have been locked. Marcus and Frank exchanged alarmed glances before moving quietly toward the sound. They found Jake Morrison in Sarah's office, rifling through her filing cabinets with practiced efficiency. "Looking for something specific?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying more calm than he felt. Jake didn't seem surprised to be caught. Instead, he straightened up with a manila folder in his hands, Bruno's medical records and documentation. "Just doing some research on your unusual patient," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Funny thing about bears with this level of intelligence, they're worth a lot of money to the right buyers." Frank stepped forward, his veterinary training kicking in despite his age. "Those records are confidential. You have no legal right." "Legal right?" Jake's laugh was harsh and bitter. Let me tell you about legal rights. I had the legal right to a job that supported my family. I had the legal right to expect that my service protecting these forests would mean something when budget cuts came. But legal rights don't mean much when politicians decide trees are more important than people. Jake's story poured out with the fury of years of accumulated resentment. His daughter Emily had needed specialized medical treatment for childhood leukemia. The insurance that came with his ranger position had covered most costs, but when he lost his job, they lost their coverage. Emily had died 6 months later, not from cancer, but from complications that better medical care might have prevented. So, forgive me if I don't share your sentimental attachment to wildlife, Jake continued, his voice dripping with venom. That bear represents more money than I've seen since my world fell apart. $500,000 from buyers who appreciate unique animals. Enough to pay off Emily's medical bills and maybe start over somewhere else. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. $500,000, exactly the amount he needed for Tommy's surgery. The coincidence felt like the universe playing a cruel joke. "The bear stays here," Frank said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. Jake's expression hardened. "Actually, he doesn't. See, keeping wild animals without proper federal permits is a serious crime. I've already contacted the appropriate authorities about your little illegal operation. They'll be here tomorrow to confiscate the bear unless—" He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Unless we come to a mutually beneficial arrangement." Sarah chose that moment to return from her evening supply run, walking into a standoff that would force all of them to confront their deepest values and most desperate needs. As she took in the scene, Jake holding Bruno's files, Frank's guilty expression, and Marcus's obvious internal conflict, her maternal instincts flared into protective fury. "Over my dead body," she said quietly, setting down her grocery bags with deliberate calm. "That bear is under my protection, and he's not going anywhere." But even as Sarah spoke the words, Marcus was calculating timelines and possibilities. 30 days had become 22, then 20, then 18. Tommy was running out of time, and Marcus was running out of options. Jake Morrison's offer, however morally repugnant, represented Tommy's only realistic chance at the surgery that could save his life. The choice that had been theoretical was now immediate and unavoidable: save the bear who had captured his heart, or save the son who carried his blood. Marcus looked at Bruno, peacefully sleeping despite the human drama surrounding him, and felt his heart break in ways he didn't think were possible. "Give me 24 hours, Marcus heard himself saying, though the words seemed to come from someone else. "I need 24 hours to think about this." Sarah's face went white with betrayal, while Frank's expression showed the recognition of a man who understood impossible choices. Jake Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who knew he'd already won. As the confrontation broke up and everyone returned to their respective homes, Marcus remained at the sanctuary, sitting on the floor of Bruno's enclosure while the young bear slept with his head in Marcus's lap. For the first time since the rescue, Bruno seemed restless, as if sensing that their carefully constructed world was about to shatter. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered into the darkness, unsure whether he was apologizing to Bruno, to Tommy, or to himself. "I'm so damn sorry." The 24 hours Marcus had asked for stretched into the longest day of his life. He drove aimlessly through the Montana countryside, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from Sarah, Frank, and Jake Morrison, all of which he ignored. The weight of choosing between Tommy and Bruno pressed down on him like the mountain peaks surrounding the valley, each option feeling like a betrayal of someone he loved. At dawn, Marcus found himself sitting in his truck outside Denver Children's Hospital, 300 miles from the sanctuary. He hadn't planned the trip, but his subconscious had driven him here during the sleepless night. Through the hospital's windows, he could see the pediatric wing where Tommy spent his days, trapped in a world of silence and confusion, and Marcus felt his resolve crystallizing into something harder than Montana granite. Doctor. Jennifer Chen met him in the hospital cafeteria, her expression professionally sympathetic but tinged with the urgency that medical professionals couldn't entirely hide when discussing terminal timelines. Mr. Reed, I'm glad you called. Tommy's latest scans show some concerning developments. The window for the experimental procedure is narrowing faster than we anticipated. How long do I have? Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the outside. After that, the neural pathways we need to access will be too damaged for the procedure to be effective. Dr. Chen's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering life-altering news. I know the financial burden is overwhelming, but there are some experimental funding programs. I can get the money, Marcus interrupted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. $500,000 within the week. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Reed, I hope you're not considering anything irregular. There are legal ways to raise funds, fundraising campaigns, charitable foundations. It's legal, Marcus assured her, though the definition of legal seemed increasingly fluid in his current situation, just not conventional. The drive back to Montana took 6 hours, during which Marcus constructed and deconstructed his decision a dozen times. He thought about Bruno's extraordinary intelligence, his gentle nature, his obvious attachment to Sarah and Frank. But then he thought about Tommy, about his son's rare moments of clarity when his eyes would focus and Marcus could glimpse the brilliant mind trapped inside an uncooperative brain. Sarah was waiting for him at the sanctuary, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night. Bruno sensed the tension immediately, positioning himself between Marcus and Sarah as if trying to bridge whatever chasm had opened between his human family. "You're going to sell him," Sarah said, her voice flat with the certainty of someone who had reached an unwelcome conclusion. "To that monster, Jake Morrison." Marcus couldn't meet her eyes. "My son is dying, Sarah. The surgery could save him, give him a chance at a normal life. I can't let Tommy die when I have the power to save him." "And what about Bruno?" Sarah's voice rose with maternal fury. "He trusts us. He loves us. You're talking about selling him like he's a commodity instead of a living being with feelings and intelligence." Frank appeared from the back office, his weathered face showing the weight of his own guilty secrets. "Marcus, son, I understand the impossible position you're in, but selling Bruno to Jake Morrison, that man has connections to the illegal wildlife trade. You'd be condemning Bruno to a life of exploitation, possibly worse." "Then what would you have me do?" Marcus exploded, months of suppressed anguish finally erupting. "Let my son die." "Watch Tommy waste away in that facility while I play house with a bear. I love Bruno, but he's not my child." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Marcus immediately regretted their harshness. Bruno's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He backed away from Marcus with confusion and hurt evident in his dark eyes, as if understanding that he was being rejected by someone he trusted completely. Sarah's face crumpled with the pain of someone watching another family disintegrate. "Love isn't a pie, Marcus. You don't get smaller pieces when you share it with more people. It's like lighting candles from other candles. Each flame burns just as bright." But Marcus had made his decision during the long drive home. Tommy was his son, his responsibility, his blood. Bruno was an animal, however extraordinary, and animals could adapt to new situations in ways that children with autism could not. The logic felt sound even as his heart screamed against it. Jake Morrison arrived that afternoon with a trailer and paperwork that looked suspiciously official. His buyers, he explained, were exotic animal collectors who appreciated Bruno's unique abilities and would provide excellent care in a controlled environment. The euphemisms didn't disguise the reality that Bruno would likely spend the rest of his life in captivity, performing for wealthy clients who viewed him as an expensive novelty. 500,000 cash, Jake confirmed, producing a briefcase that seemed absurdly dramatic but contained the exact amount Marcus needed. My buyers are very excited about acquiring such an intelligent specimen. Bruno seemed to understand that something momentous was happening. He moved restlessly around his enclosure, occasionally approaching the humans with obvious distress. When Jake opened the transport crate, Bruno's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared up on his hind legs, roaring with a fury that none of them had ever witnessed before. "He knows," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He knows what's happening, and he's terrified." Frank stepped forward with a tranquilizer gun, his hands shaking with more than age. "I can sedate him for transport. It'll be easier for everyone." But as Frank raised the tranquilizer gun, Bruno did something that shattered what remained of Marcus's resolve. The young bear, instead of continuing his aggressive display, suddenly dropped to all fours and approached Marcus directly. He pressed his massive head against Marcus's chest and made a sound that was disturbingly close to a human sob. "I can't," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't do this to him." Jake Morrison's expression hardened with the fury of someone watching a lucrative deal collapse. "You don't have a choice, Reed. I've already reported your illegal wildlife operation to federal authorities. They'll be here tomorrow to confiscate the bear anyway. At least this way, you get compensated." "What authorities?" Frank demanded, his veterinary instincts sensing deception. Jake's smile was thin and predatory. "Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't take kindly to unlicensed bear rehabilitation. The penalties include hefty fines and possible jail time, unless, of course, the bear is transferred to licensed facilities before they arrive." Sarah's face went pale as she realized the trap Jake had constructed around them. Even if Marcus refused the money, they would still lose Bruno, and Marcus would still be unable to save Tommy. Jake had maneuvered them into a position where he won regardless of their choice. But Frank Henderson had been a veterinarian for 40 years, and he knew something about federal wildlife regulations that Jake Morrison had overlooked. "The Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't handle domestic rehabilitation cases," Frank said quietly. "That falls under state jurisdiction, and Montana has reciprocity agreements with federal permits for emergency wildlife care." Jake's confident expression flickered momentarily. "The paperwork I filed is fraudulent," Frank continued, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling Agent Martinez at Fish and Wildlife right now. She's an old friend, and she'll be very interested to hear about someone filing false reports in their name." The confrontation escalated rapidly. Jake Morrison, realizing his carefully constructed scheme was unraveling, made a desperate grab for the briefcase of money while simultaneously reaching for what appeared to be a weapon concealed under his jacket. Bruno's reaction was instantaneous and protective. He broke free from his enclosure with a display of strength that sent the metal door flying and positioned himself between Jake and his human family. In the chaos that followed, several things happened almost simultaneously. Jake drew a gun, screaming about his dead daughter and the money he needed to start over. Sarah threw herself in front of Bruno, maternal instincts overriding self-preservation. Frank shouted into his phone for emergency assistance while Marcus lunged toward Jake, trying to prevent a tragedy that seemed inevitable. But it was Bruno who took control of the situation. With intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, the young bear feinted toward Jake's right side, causing the man to turn and fire wildly into the air, then circled behind him with remarkable stealth. A single powerful swipe of Bruno's paw sent Jake crashing into the wall, unconscious but breathing. As sirens wailed in the distance, Marcus knelt beside Bruno, running his hands over the bear's fur to check for injuries. Bruno was unharmed but clearly traumatized, pressing close to Marcus with obvious need for reassurance. You saved us, Marcus whispered, understanding finally that the rescue at Miller's Creek had been mutual. You saved all of us. Sarah collapsed into a chair, the adrenaline leaving her shaky but determined. We're keeping him, she declared with fierce finality. I don't care what it takes or what laws we have to navigate. Bruno stays with his family. Frank nodded, his phone call having confirmed that Jake's federal reports were indeed fraudulent and that Bruno's care under emergency wildlife protocols was completely legal. Agent Martinez is sending someone to sort this out properly. Jake Morrison is going to be facing federal charges for fraud and threats. But even as they celebrated their victory over Jake's scheme, Marcus knew that his fundamental problem remained unsolved. Tommy still needed surgery, the money was still beyond his reach, and time was still running out. The briefcase of cash lay on the floor where Jake had dropped it, representing salvation for Tommy and damnation for Bruno. As if reading his thoughts, Bruno approached the briefcase and with deliberate precision knocked it over. The cash scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, and Bruno sat down in the middle of it, looking up at Marcus with an expression that seemed to say, "Choose love, not money." Marcus knelt among the scattered bills, pulling Bruno's massive head against his chest, and finally understood what Sarah had tried to tell him about love being like candles lighting other candles. Saving Bruno hadn't cost him his love for Tommy. It had shown him that both loves could burn equally bright if he was brave enough to let them. The question now was whether there was still time to save them both. The victory over Jake Morrison felt hollow as the weight of Marcus's unchanged reality settled back over the sanctuary like Montana winter. Tommy still needed surgery. The $500,000 remained as far out of reach as ever, and the timeline Dr. Chen had given him continued its relentless countdown. Watching the federal agents cart away Jake's fraudulent money felt like watching his son's last hope disappear in an evidence bag. 3 days after the confrontation, Marcus received the call he'd been dreading. His ex-wife, Jennifer's voice, carried the brittle control of someone barely holding herself together. "Marcus, you need to come to Denver. Now. Tommy's had another episode, and Dr. Chen says we're running out of time faster than expected." The drive to Denver passed in a blur of self-recrimination and desperate calculations. Marcus had liquidated everything he owned, borrowed against future earnings, and even set up a crowdfunding campaign that had raised barely $10,000 despite going viral on social media. Well-meaning strangers offered thoughts and prayers, but thoughts and prayers couldn't fund experimental brain surgery. At the hospital, Tommy looked smaller than Marcus remembered, lost among the machines and monitors that tracked his vital signs. His son's rare moments of lucidity had become increasingly brief, and the autism that had stolen his voice seemed to be claiming more ground each day. Dr. Chen's latest scans showed troubling developments, brain swelling that made the surgical window even narrower. "We have maybe a week," Dr. Chen explained, her professional composure cracking slightly as she delivered the devastating timeline. "After that, the procedure becomes too risky, and the potential for meaningful recovery drops to almost zero." Jennifer sat beside Tommy's bed, holding his small hand while tears streamed silently down her face. She'd remarried 2 years ago to a kind man who loved Tommy as his own, but even their combined resources couldn't approach the astronomical cost of the experimental surgery. "I failed him," Marcus whispered, watching his son's peaceful face as Tommy slept. "I had a chance to get the money, and I chose an animal over my own child." "You chose not to betray someone who trusted you," Jennifer corrected, surprising Marcus with her understanding. "Tommy would be proud of that choice if he could understand it. You raised him to be compassionate, Marcus. Don't lose that part of yourself now." But Marcus barely heard her words. In his mind, he replayed the moment when he'd refused Jake Morrison's blood money, the moment when Bruno had scattered the cash across the sanctuary floor. Had he made the right choice? Or had his sentimentality condemned his son to a life of silence and confusion? The answer came in the form of an unexpected phone call that evening, as Marcus sat in his hotel room, staring at legal documents that would place Tommy in permanent residential care. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Agent Martinez from Fish and Wildlife Service. "Dr. Reed, this is Agent Martinez. I wanted to follow up on the Jake Morrison situation, but I'm calling about something else entirely. Your bear, Bruno, has attracted some attention from people you might want to meet." Marcus's blood ran cold. What kind of attention? The good kind, I hope. There's a documentary filmmaker named David Chen. Dr. Jennifer Chen's husband, actually, who's been following Bruno's story through our investigation. He's very interested in featuring Bruno in a project about wildlife rehabilitation and the bonds between humans and animals. The connection hit Marcus like lightning. Dr. Jennifer Chen, Tommy's surgeon, was married to a documentary filmmaker. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be real, but Agent Martinez continued with details that made Marcus's heart race with something he hadn't felt in months: hope. David Chen has been documenting cases like Bruno's for a film about extraordinary animal intelligence and the ethical questions surrounding wildlife rehabilitation. He's particularly interested in Bruno's story because of the parallels to his wife's work with autism research. Both deal with unique minds that don't fit conventional understanding. Marcus barely managed to stay coherent during the rest of the conversation. David Chen wanted to interview Marcus, Sarah, and Frank about Bruno's rescue and development. More importantly, the documentary had significant funding from a foundation dedicated to autism research and animal welfare, the same foundation that sometimes provided grants for experimental medical procedures. The meeting took place the next morning in the hospital cafeteria, with David Chen proving to be as passionate about Bruno's story as his wife was about Tommy's case. David was a small, intense man with the rapid-fire speech of someone accustomed to pitching projects to skeptical investors. "Bruno's story is exactly what our foundation looks for," David explained, his tablet displaying footage that Agent Martinez had shared from the sanctuary. An extraordinary bond between species, questions about intelligence and communication, and the ethical dilemmas of wildlife rehabilitation. But what makes it perfect for our current project is the parallel to autism research. Dr. Jennifer Chen joined them, her medical expertise adding weight to her husband's enthusiasm. "Both Bruno and Tommy represent minds that don't fit conventional categories," she explained. "Bruno's enhanced learning ability mirrors some of the savant capabilities we see in autism spectrum disorders. The Foundation is particularly interested in stories that show the value of every unique mind." Marcus felt like he was drowning in hope and terror simultaneously. "What exactly are you proposing?" David leaned forward, his excitement palpable. "Full documentary rights to Bruno's story, including rehabilitation footage, interviews with his caretakers, and long-term follow-up. In exchange, the Foundation provides funding for Tommy's surgery, plus a substantial donation to Sarah's sanctuary for Bruno's continued care." The offer was more than Marcus had dared hope for, but years of disappointment made him wary of solutions that seemed too good to be true. "How much funding?" $750,000, Dr. Chen answered. "Enough for Tommy's surgery, post-operative care, and a substantial buffer for any complications." Marcus stared at them, unable to process the magnitude of what they were offering. Why? Why would the Foundation spend that much money on a documentary? David's expression grew serious. because stories like Bruno's change how people think about intelligence, about the value of different minds, about our responsibility to those who can't advocate for themselves. Whether it's a bear with extraordinary learning ability or a child with autism, society benefits when we recognize and nurture unique capabilities instead of dismissing them as abnormalities. The conversation continued for another hour, covering legal details, filming schedules, and ethical safeguards to ensure Bruno's welfare throughout the documentary process. But Marcus barely heard the specifics. His mind kept returning to the impossible coincidence that had brought Bruno's story to the attention of the one foundation that could save both the bear and his son. When he called Sarah with the news, her reaction was pure joy mixed with maternal pride. "I knew Bruno was special," she said through tears. "I knew God sent him to us for a reason." Frank's response was more complex, colored by his guilt over the circumstances of Bruno's mother's death. "The boy deserves something good to come from all this tragedy," he said quietly. "Maybe this is how the universe balances the scales." But it was Bruno's reaction that sealed Marcus's decision. When he returned to the sanctuary to discuss the documentary proposal with Sarah and Frank, Bruno approached him with obvious excitement, as if sensing that something positive was happening. The young bear pressed his head against Marcus's chest in the gesture that had become their special greeting, and Marcus finally understood what Sarah had meant about love being like candles lighting other candles. Saving Bruno hadn't cost him his chance to save Tommy. It had created the connection that made saving both of them possible. The bear's extraordinary story had captured the attention of people who understood that every unique mind deserves protection and nurturing, whether that mind belongs to an autistic child or an unusually intelligent bear. As Marcus signed the documentary agreement, he felt the crushing weight of impossible choices finally lifting from his shoulders. Tommy would get his surgery, Bruno would remain with his sanctuary family, and their intertwined stories would help other families facing similar challenges. But even as hope flooded back into his life, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their struggles weren't over. The documentary would bring attention, both positive and negative, to their unusual situation. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Frank's warnings about Bruno's unusual development continued to echo, suggesting that the young bear's story held secrets that none of them yet understood. For now, though, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that love and sacrifice could coexist, that choosing compassion didn't require abandoning family, and that sometimes the greatest rescue was the one that saved everyone involved. The documentary filming began 3 weeks later, coinciding with Tommy's pre-surgical preparations at Denver Children's Hospital. Marcus found himself caught between two worlds: the sterile, technology-filled environment where his son underwent endless tests and evaluations, and the natural beauty of the Montana sanctuary where Bruno continued to amaze everyone with his extraordinary development. David Chen's film crew captured every aspect of Bruno's daily life with Sarah and Frank, documenting behaviors that seemed to defy conventional understanding of bear intelligence. Bruno had learned to open increasingly complex locks, demonstrated problem-solving abilities that impressed animal behaviorists, and showed emotional responses that felt disturbingly human. When the cameras rolled, Bruno performed with the natural charisma of a born entertainer, almost as if he understood the importance of the documentation process. But it was during the off-camera moments that Bruno's true nature revealed itself most clearly. Sarah had begun reading to him each evening, and Bruno would sit quietly beside her chair, his dark eyes following the movement of her lips with an attention that suggested genuine comprehension. Frank documented Bruno's interactions with other rescued animals, noting how the young bear seemed to serve as a calming influence on traumatized wildlife, a role that went far beyond normal bear behavior. Marcus commuted between Montana and Denver, his heart torn between monitoring Tommy's pre-surgical progress and ensuring Bruno's welfare during the intensive filming schedule. The documentary crew treated Bruno with obvious respect and affection, but Marcus worried about the stress of constant attention on an animal who had already endured significant trauma. It was during one of these trips between locations that Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. Frank's voice carried an urgency that immediately set off alarm bells. "Marcus, you need to get back here now. We've had visitors asking questions about Bruno, and I don't think they're with the documentary crew." The 3-hour drive from Denver felt like an eternity. Frank's cryptic warning had provided few details, but the fear in the old veterinarian's voice suggested something far more serious than curious tourists or local reporters. Marcus arrived at the sanctuary to find Frank and Sarah huddled in the office, their faces pale with a combination of fear and confusion. "Government people," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not Fish and Wildlife, something else. They showed credentials, but they were asking very specific questions about Bruno's mother, about where exactly we found her, about any unusual characteristics in her behavior or appearance." Frank's weathered hands shook as he poured coffee he clearly didn't want. "They knew things, Marcus. Details about bear behavior, about maternal instincts, about stress responses that most people wouldn't understand. These weren't wildlife officials, they were researchers." The pieces of a larger puzzle began forming in Marcus's mind, connecting Frank's earlier nervousness about Bruno's unusual development with these mysterious government visitors. "What kind of questions exactly?" "They wanted to know if we'd found any medical equipment near the mother bear's body," Sarah continued. "Specifically, they asked about radio collars, tracking devices, or any signs of previous medical intervention. When we said no, they seemed relieved, but then they started asking about Bruno's learning capabilities." Frank's expression grew more troubled. "They knew about his problem-solving abilities, Marcus. They described behaviors we've never discussed publicly, the lock opening, the puzzle boxes, the way he responds to classical music. Someone's been watching us." The revelation that Bruno might have been under surveillance sent chills through Marcus's spine. He thought about the young bear's extraordinary intelligence, the surgical scars Frank had mentioned finding on his mother, and the too convenient timing of Jake Morrison's appearance. What if Bruno's mother hadn't simply been an unlucky victim of illegal trapping? What if she had been part of something larger and more sinister? David Chen arrived that evening for another filming session, but his usual enthusiasm was tempered by the news of the government visit. As a documentary filmmaker who often dealt with sensitive subjects, David had contacts in various federal agencies who might provide insight into the mysterious investigators. "I'll make some calls," David promised, his professional instincts clearly aroused by the potential story implications. "But Marcus, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Bruno's background is more complicated than any of us realized." That night, Marcus sat with Bruno in the young bear's enclosure, studying his behavior for signs of whatever had attracted government attention. Bruno seemed to sense Marcus's anxiety, pressing close and making the soft huffing sounds that had become his way of offering comfort. But as Marcus looked into Bruno's intelligent dark eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that the bear understood far more about his own situation than any of them realized. The answers came 2 days later, delivered by Agent Martinez in a conversation that shattered Marcus's assumptions about Bruno's origins. The Fish and Wildlife agent arrived at the sanctuary with a folder full of documents and an expression that mixed professional duty with personal regret. "I'm going to tell you something that's classified, but you deserve to know what you've gotten involved in," Agent Martinez began, her voice carrying the weight of difficult truths. "Bruno's mother wasn't just any bear. She was part of a research program that was shut down 2 years ago. A program that shouldn't have existed in the first place." The story that emerged was both fascinating and horrifying. A private research facility, operating under government contracts, had been conducting experiments on wildlife intelligence and learning capacity. The research focused on understanding how environmental factors could enhance cognitive development in various species, with the ultimate goal of applying those insights to human neurological conditions. They were specifically interested in maternal stress responses and how they might affect offspring development, Agent Martinez explained, her professional tone barely concealing her disgust. Pregnant bears were subjected to controlled stress situations designed to trigger specific hormonal responses that might enhance fetal brain development. Marcus felt sick as the implications became clear. Bruno's extraordinary intelligence wasn't natural. It was the result of experiments conducted on his mother while she was pregnant. The surgical scars Frank had found weren't from medical treatment but from research procedures designed to monitor the effects of induced stress on maternal behavior and fetal development. The program was shut down when an internal whistleblower exposed the unethical nature of the research, Agent Martinez continued. But several pregnant subjects had already escaped or been released before the facility could be secured. Bruno's mother was one of them. Sarah's face had gone white with fury and heartbreak. "You're telling us that Bruno's intelligence comes from torturing his mother? That his gifts are the result of abuse?" The research was classified as animal abuse by the investigating committee, Agent Martinez confirmed. The facility was closed, the researchers were prosecuted, and we've been tracking the escaped subjects ever since. Bruno's mother managed to survive in the wild for almost 2 years before the trap wounds and infection killed her. Frank's guilt about euthanizing Bruno's mother took on new dimensions as he realized she had been a victim of human cruelty long before she encountered illegal traps. She was trying to protect him from people like the ones who had already hurt her, he said quietly. No wonder she fought so hard to keep him safe. The government agents who had visited weren't looking for Bruno to continue the experiments. They were part of a task force ensuring that all remaining subjects were properly documented and protected. Bruno's case was particularly important because he represented the only surviving offspring from the research program, making him both scientifically valuable and ethically significant. "What does this mean for Bruno?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer. "Legally, he's protected under federal endangered species protocols as a victim of illegal research," Agent Martinez explained. "But there are still researchers who would be very interested in studying his development, and not all of them have ethical motivations." David Chen's documentary suddenly took on new significance. By publicizing Bruno's story, they were both protecting him through public attention and potentially exposing him to people who might exploit his unique capabilities. The foundation funding Tommy's surgery had unknowingly become involved in a story with much larger implications than they'd realized. That evening, as Marcus processed the devastating truth about Bruno's origins, he watched the young bear interact with Sarah and Frank with his usual gentle affection. Bruno's extraordinary intelligence came from trauma inflicted on his mother, but his capacity for love and trust seemed to be entirely his own. Despite being the product of unethical experimentation, Bruno had chosen to form bonds with the humans who had saved him, demonstrating a resilience that was perhaps even more remarkable than his cognitive abilities. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that Bruno's story paralleled Tommy's in unexpected ways. Both were unique minds shaped by circumstances beyond their control. Both faced uncertain futures in a world that didn't fully understand their capabilities, and both depended on the love and advocacy of people who refused to give up on them. As Marcus held Bruno's massive head in his lap that night, he made a silent promise that the young bear would never again be subjected to exploitation or abuse. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Bruno had found his family, and that family would protect him with the same fierce determination that was saving Tommy. But even as Marcus made that promise, he couldn't shake the feeling that Bruno's past was about to collide with his present in ways that would test all of them. The documentary had attracted attention from people who saw Bruno as more than just an extraordinary animal. They saw him as proof that intelligence could be artificially enhanced, and that knowledge was worth more than any single bear's welfare. The battle for Bruno's future was just beginning, and Marcus wasn't sure that love and determination would be enough to win it. 6 months later, the Montana Sanctuary had transformed into something Marcus never could have imagined during those desperate early days when choosing between Bruno and Tommy felt like an impossible betrayal of love itself. The documentary Bonds Beyond Species had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and critical acclaim, bringing global attention to both Bruno's extraordinary story and the ethical questions surrounding wildlife rehabilitation and animal intelligence research. Tommy's surgery had been a resounding success. The experimental procedure had given Marcus's son access to communication pathways that had been locked away for years, and while his progress was gradual, each new word felt like a miracle. Tommy's first full sentence, spoken 3 months after surgery, had been recorded by the documentary cameras. "I want to meet Bruno." The moment had become the emotional centerpiece of the film, capturing the parallel journeys of two unique minds, learning to navigate a world that didn't always understand their gifts. The sanctuary itself had evolved into a model facility for ethical wildlife rehabilitation, drawing visitors, researchers, and students from around the world. The foundation's donation had funded not only Tommy's medical care, but also state-of-the-art facilities that allowed Bruno to thrive while contributing to legitimate research on animal cognition and human-animal bonds. Unlike the cruel experiments that had marked his origins, this research was conducted with Bruno's welfare as the primary consideration, with protocols that ensured his autonomy and dignity. Bruno, now nearly 2 years old and weighing over 200 pounds, had become a bridge between the wild and domestic worlds. He remained bonded to his human family while retaining his natural bear instincts, creating a unique situation that offered insights into both animal behavior and the nature of interspecies relationships. His enclosure had been expanded into a naturalistic habitat that allowed him to exhibit normal bear behaviors while maintaining the close relationships that had sustained him through his early trauma. Marcus had taken a sabbatical from his research position to write a book about their experience, working closely with Sarah and Frank to document not just Bruno's development, but the profound ways their lives had been changed by the decision to save one small, drowning bear cub. The book, titled The Bear Who Saved Us All, was scheduled for publication in the spring and had already generated significant interest from publishers worldwide. Tommy's visits to the sanctuary had become a regular part of his therapy regimen. The connection between the autistic boy and the enhanced intelligence bear was remarkable to witness, with both seeming to understand each other in ways that transcended typical communication barriers. Tommy would sit quietly beside Bruno's enclosure for hours, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes simply sharing the comfortable silence that both unique minds seemed to appreciate. "Bruno saved Daddy like Daddy saved Bruno," Tommy had explained to Dr. Chen during one of his follow-up appointments, his improved communication skills allowing him to express concepts that had been trapped inside his mind for years. But really, we all saved each other. Sarah had found the purpose and family she'd been seeking since her children left home. At 53, she had become a nationally recognized advocate for ethical animal treatment and wildlife rehabilitation, speaking at conferences and universities about the importance of recognizing the emotional complexity of animal minds. Her relationship with Marcus had deepened from shared crisis into something that felt like the foundation for a new kind of family. One that included Tommy, Bruno, and Frank as integral members. Frank, despite his advanced age, had experienced a renaissance of purpose in his final years. His confession about euthanizing Bruno's mother had initially threatened to destroy his reputation, but the documentary's honest portrayal of his impossible choice had instead elevated him to the status of an ethics advocate in veterinary medicine. He now counseled young veterinarians facing difficult decisions, using his experience with Bruno's family to illustrate the complex moral landscape of animal care. The government task force monitoring Bruno's welfare had become allies rather than threats, with Agent Martinez serving as an unofficial liaison between the sanctuary and federal wildlife agencies. The researchers who had conducted the original experiments were serving federal prison sentences, and new legislation had been passed to prevent similar abuse of wildlife in the name of scientific progress. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Bruno himself. Despite his traumatic origins and the circumstances that had enhanced his intelligence, he had chosen love over fear, trust over suspicion, and connection over isolation. His daily interactions with visitors, researchers, and his human family demonstrated a capacity for forgiveness and resilience that inspired everyone who met him. During the documentary's premiere in New York, Marcus had stood on stage with Sarah, Frank, and Tommy, watching clips of their journey from that first desperate morning at Miller's Creek to Bruno's current status as an ambassador for ethical animal treatment. The standing ovation from the audience felt like validation not just of their story, but of the principle that love and sacrifice could coexist, that choosing compassion didn't require abandoning family. Sometimes the greatest rescue is the one that saves our own humanity, Marcus had said during his acceptance speech for the documentary's Humanitarian Award. Bruno taught us that intelligence without love is meaningless, but love without sacrifice is impossible. He showed us that family isn't defined by biology or species, it's defined by the choice to care for each other despite the costs. The sanctuary's guest book was filled with testimonials from visitors whose lives had been touched by Bruno's story. Parents of special needs children found hope in Tommy's progress. Animal welfare advocates found inspiration in Bruno's resilience. Researchers found new perspectives on the ethical boundaries of scientific inquiry. But most visitors simply found renewed faith in the possibility that love could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Jake Morrison, serving a reduced sentence for his wildlife trafficking charges, had written a letter of apology that arrived on the anniversary of the confrontation. His daughter's death and his subsequent descent into illegal activities had been driven by grief and desperation, emotions that Marcus understood all too well. The letter expressed genuine remorse and gratitude that his actions hadn't resulted in tragedy for Bruno or his human family. As spring returned to Montana, Marcus often found himself sitting beside Bruno's enclosure in the early morning hours, reflecting on the chain of events that had brought them all together. The bear who had nearly drowned in Miller's Creek had become the catalyst for healing that none of them could have achieved alone. Tommy's increasing ability to communicate allowed him to express the complex emotions that autism had previously trapped inside his mind. Sarah had found the family she'd been seeking. Frank had found redemption for his past mistakes. And Marcus had learned that love wasn't a finite resource that diminished when shared, but an infinite capacity that grew stronger with each connection. Bruno seemed to understand his role as the heart of their unusual family. When Tommy visited, the massive bear would sit quietly beside the boy, offering a comforting presence that needed no words. When Sarah read aloud during evening visits, Bruno would position himself to see both her face and the book, as if following along with the story. When Frank conducted his gentle medical examinations, Bruno cooperated with the trust of someone who understood that some pain was necessary for healing. The documentary's success had brought opportunities that extended far beyond their small Montana sanctuary. Tommy's story had inspired new research into autism treatment, with several medical centers requesting to study the therapeutic benefits of human-animal bonds in neurodivergent children. Bruno's case had influenced wildlife protection legislation and sparked important conversations about the ethics of animal research. But for Marcus, the greatest success was measured in smaller moments. Tommy's laughter echoing through the sanctuary as Bruno demonstrated a new trick. Sarah's contentment as she tucked Bruno in for the night, Frank's peaceful expression as he watched the family he'd helped save thrive together. And somewhere in the Montana wilderness, where Miller's Creek continued its ancient flow toward distant valleys, the memory of a mother bear's final act of love lived on in the extraordinary creature she'd protected with her life and in the human family who had chosen to honor that sacrifice with their own acts of love and devotion. Sometimes, life asks us to choose between two things we love, and we think that choice will break us. Marcus Reed faced that impossible decision when his autistic son needed life-saving surgery he couldn't afford, while the bear cub he'd rescued needed protection from those who would exploit him. For months, Marcus believed that saving one meant abandoning the other, that love was a pie with finite slices, not a candle that could light infinite flames without dimming. But Bruno, the extraordinary bear whose intelligence came from his mother's sacrifice, taught Marcus something profound about the nature of family. When we choose compassion over convenience, when we refuse to abandon those who trust us even when it costs us everything, we don't lose, we discover that love multiplies when shared. Today, Tommy speaks in full sentences. Bruno thrives as an ambassador for ethical animal treatment, and their unusual family proves that the bonds we forge through sacrifice are stronger than those given by blood alone. The greatest rescue isn't always the dramatic moment of pulling someone from drowning waters. Sometimes it's the daily choice to keep loving when love feels impossible. What impossible choice in your life turned out to be the doorway to unexpected blessings? Have you ever discovered that loving someone unexpected actually expanded your capacity to love rather than diminished it? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.